now that we've decided what we're going to say, we can get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's lecture entitled, or lecture pair, entitled Migration, Refugee Management and the New International Criminality. My name is Peter Burgess from the International Peace Research Institute in Oslo and from the Institute for European Studies here right across the street. This is the penultimate, the next to the last lecture in our semester-long series, Europe Under Threat, Security, Migration and Integration. I have to apologize to you for last week's fiasco. As you might have known, 2 of the 3-member team were stricken with the Mexican flu, which is actually where I come from. It's known as the swine flu. So cross-cultural commentaries are welcome on that. But both Serge Gutwit and one of our speakers was ill and was in bed, and so that we decided to just cancel the entire evening. All the more reason to make things twice as good this evening with our guests Hosein and Paul de Hert. And then another complication tonight, Professor de Hert had some very another pressing engagement, which has drawn him away from the first half of the session. But he'll be arriving at about 6:45. So kindly enough, Rocco Bellanova, his close collaborator, will share the burden of his talk with him, and we'll actually get 3 for the same money, 3 for the price of 2 speakers. What else can I tell you? This is the second to last lecture. The next lecture I have to announce to you now, in case you're crossing your fingers for Giorgio Agamben. He will not be coming next week, to our great chagrin, but he will be replaced by Bradley Evans from Leeds University, and together with the original speaker, Emilio Mordini. And so the competence of these 2 will give the entire evening a bit of a biosecurity orientation, which I think will be very interesting and will be a very good summary for the entire lecture series. So a little presentation of our speakers, the 3 of them. Gus Hosein is a visiting fellow in the Information Systems and Innovation Group in the Department of Management at the LSE, the London School of Economics and Political Science. He's a senior fellow at the Privacy International and a visiting scholar at the American Civil Liberties Union Project on Technology and Liberty as well. He's a co-founder of the LSE-funded Policy Engagement Network, which has projects on internet governance, identity policy and constitutional change, and he's a consultant for governmental and intergovernmental institutions, a variety of them. He holds degrees in mathematics from the University of Waterloo in Canada, information system security and technology policy and regulation from the University of London. And his research and publications related to the study of policy and law, as you will hear, mostly surrounding privacy and civil liberties issues. Then the absent Dr. Paul de Hert, who will not be introduced in his presence, is an international human rights expert, as you might know if you studied with him, working primarily on criminal law and technology and privacy law. He holds the chair of criminal law and international European criminal law here at the Vrije, and he has previously had the chair in human rights, legal theory and constitutional criminal law as well. In addition, he is director of the Vrije Research Group on Fundamental Rights and Constitutionalism. He's the director of the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies of Law and a core member of the Vrije Research Group Law, Science, Technology and Society, which is, of course, the co-organizer of this studies. And now you understand why he doesn't have time to come to the lecture. He's also co-editor-in-chief of Supranational Criminal Law Series and New Journal of European Criminal Law. Then Rocco Bellanova, to my right, is a researcher working on data protection applied to security measures at both the Faculté Universitaire Saint-Louis and at the Vrije. He's a member of the Interdisciplinary Research Group on Law, Science, Technology and Society, again, the LSTS, the co-organizer, and the Centre de Recherche en Sciences Politiques at Saint-Louis. He also works as an assistant in international relations, political science, and contemporary political issues and has helped to organize computers, privacy, and data protection conferences in 2009, 2010, and the European Privacy Day activities. Well, I'm exhausted. The format will be almost the same. That is, we'll start with Dr. Hosein will speak 30 to 40 minutes. And then between Rocco Bellanova and Dr. Hert, we'll have, again, 30 minutes. And just how that time gets divided will depend on when Dr. Hert arrives. So I give the floor, without further delay, to Gus Hosein.
Thank you for having me over. It's a pleasure to finally actually be at this university. I've run into so many of the members of staff over the years, but I've never actually been here, although I could ask for better weather today. This is the first time giving this presentation. Usually when you've been teaching long enough and on the conference circuit long enough, you tend to get the same presentation over and over again. But this was a good opportunity to try something new. It's the result of 2 years of work I've been doing with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR. They called me up just under 2 years ago, kind of panicking, because they were having some problems with their IT systems, and they were in some dire need of help, and they managed to find me because I guess nobody else was available. So for the past 2 years I've been working with UNHCR to try to solve some of their issues, and so I'm going to present the nature of their problems to you, and actually I'm also going to talk about how it's posed problems for my colleagues and I as well, because there we go. Because I do work in the area of privacy and human rights, and I found that the case study I was working on with UNHCR with the refugees was actually causing me and my colleagues a lot of problems, because we had to reconceptualize everything that was we were doing in the case of refugees. Yes, it's easy for me to go around and speak on the importance of human rights and the importance of the right to privacy, but the refugee situation actually posed a unique situation where I had to go back and question everything I was doing before. And let's start with the human rights angle. The human rights thinkers often spend their time talking about discrimination. That is, rights should be universal, not specific. Individuals should have rights and others don't, but also the idea that we shouldn't discriminate against certain populations by taking rights away from them. And if you look at the debate in the United States post 9/11 about the treatment of foreigners, we, as human rights people, we often criticize the American government's policies as being discriminatory. So, for instance, after 9/11, one of the first acts by the Bush administration was to identify individuals who shared a similar profile to the 19 hijackers and interview these individuals. So they found 7,600 such individuals and ended up interviewing 3,000 Muslims and Arabs. And later, after these people were detained and many of them thrown out of the country, they found that in the end, really only 20 immigrants were arrested, and most actually on immigration violations. None of them were arrested on terrorism charges. So then after that program came and left, the US government then decided, oh, well, look, the 19 hijackers, many of them were in the United States as students, so we must find a way of clamping down on foreign students coming into the country and causing trouble. So they created a system called SEVIS, which is the Student and Exchange Visa Information Service, which essentially required every university and every higher education institution in the US to link up their data with the federal government to keep track of students, foreign students, and so that universities would report to the government when foreign students missed classes, for instance, or spent 2 weeks without showing up, which, at least in my course at the LSE, happens all the time, but we don't report them to the government. And when SEVIS was deployed, the universities were actually quite reluctant. They said, first of all, we shouldn't be spying on our students, but second, you're introducing a new system into our already complex information systems. But the government said, don't worry, it's not overly complex, this would all sort itself out. And in fact, it didn't work out too well in the end. In one case, 1,450 student files were stolen by hackers. Schools complained that the system was too cumbersome, not responding properly, or wasn't designed properly. And there are many complaints about unfair processes, students being thrown out of the country wrongly, and again, this discrimination issue, that we're wrongly discriminating against foreigners. So then the Bush administration came up with a new policy. They're going to do special registration procedures for certain non-immigrants. And instead of focusing just on the 7 terrorist states that everybody thought was discriminatory, the government expanded to include all those other countries that are listed in the 3rd paragraph there. And these individuals should be forced to register in government systems and be interviewed and fingerprinted. And later it was discovered of the 82,000 men who registered, more than 13,000 were found to be living illegal in the United States and were to be deported. And so you'd think the system kind of worked, but it wasn't set up to be an immigration system. It was meant to be a system that identified bad people. And so again, human rights specialists said, this is wrong, you're discriminating against a specific population. That is, in the United States, it's expected that there are many illegal immigrants. It's unfair to focus on just a certain type of illegal immigrant, and that was felt to be discriminatory. So then the Bush administration moved on to a new system called the National Security Entry-Exit Registration System. And actually, so they wanted to broaden the participation, and they borrowed from European history. When they were justifying the need for this system, and on the day of the announcement of this system, the Attorney General at the time, who was John Ashcroft, he said, look, we're just following what our European allies have been doing for decades, keeping track of our foreign visitors, making sure they're living where they say they're going to be living, and keeping track of it if they move, and just make sure they report regularly. So, and he later announced that so far the INS, which no longer exists under another department, has fingerprinted registered individuals from 112 different countries, from the Baltic to the Balkans, from the Cape of Good Hope to the Rock of Gibraltar. It's quite a poetic speech, actually, basically saying no country is exempt. We're not discriminating against people of a certain cultural background, a certain religious background, or ethnic background. We are discriminating against all foreigners equally. And that system eventually evolved into what we have now, which is the U.S. Visit Program, where you have all foreigners coming to the United States, except for Canadians and Mexicans, being fingerprinted at the border and data being taken from them, stored into a central database. And so they got rid of the concern that this system is discriminatory, because it's reasonable to keep track of foreigners, all visitors to the United States. And actually, this is a couple of paragraphs from the 9/11 Commission report, where the 9/11 Commission said, look, to prevent another terrorist attack, we must have an entry-exit system. It's integral to the security of the nation, and we must keep track of all foreigners, particularly after the shoe bomber case, where the shoe bomber was a British citizen. And so, okay, we can't discriminate just against Middle East countries, we need to discriminate equally against everybody. So in September 2004, the system went fully operational, where they were fingerprinting all visitors to the United States, and anybody over the age of 14, I believe, was the age that the U.S. government had decided upon. And while there was some international outrage at this notion, the liberal side of the United States said, well, look, this is finally completely reasonable, because we're not discriminating against anybody. So the New York Times, which is considered to be a relatively liberal newspaper, said the government has acted wisely in this situation, because all we're doing is checking photographs and fingerprints against watch lists. It's only less than half a minute per person. It is hardly an onerous burden. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security Deputy Director of the program said, look, there's no ink involved. It's like booking, so it's not like a booking process on a police station. It's a very simple device, kind of like E.T. going home, where the finger glows red. And so the human rights community responded relatively favorably, as I mentioned. And here's a quotation from Michael Ignatieff, who's now the leader of the opposition in Canada, but back in those days was a human rights thinker, saying, look, civil libertarians shouldn't be picking on these types of systems. We need strong identity systems. We need biometric systems. So this is actually a positive step forward. And he does say, to be fair to him, he says, look, we must also make sure there's transparency in the processing, that citizens and individuals are able to get access to the information that's held by the government and all of that. And so these regimes were set up to consider these rights issues. so that the US government wasn't saying we're going to collect all this information and treat you like criminals. Instead, they were saying we're collecting this information, and this information will be processed fairly. And if something goes wrong, you'll have the right of redress, where you can actually complain to the US government saying, something's gone wrong, I'm not allowed to visit the United States, please look into my situation. And the government repeatedly promised that this information will not be widely accessible to local police in the United States. In fact, it will be tightly regulated through access controls. And so again, the legal community and the international legal community kind of said, okay, fine, we can live with that, provided that there are these safeguards. And very few people actually asked the question, should this information actually be collected in the first place? The 9/11 Commission never questioned that. They said biometrics are necessary, entry-exit is necessary. Even the Europeans are now considering doing something similar. The European Union has declared that they want an entry-exit regime for both foreigners and nationals. EU citizens by 2017 is the current date. So there is a growing momentum behind these types of systems. So let's bring this to the refugee context. Are there human rights concerns when we apply these types of systems to refugees? Well, this is where things got very confusing for me, because as a privacy advocate, I would say, of course, there are clear concerns about collecting any information on these most vulnerable people, but there's also some value in collecting this information on refugees. Most importantly, for refugees to be protected, that is, to gain protection, which is protection under law, under international treaties, you must know who they are. You must be able to designate an individual or a group or a community as a refugee community or individual. And then, once they are recognized as such, all the rights from international treaties follow. And on top of that, they can also gain access to services, which are obviously integral to their livelihood, such as getting access to medical services, getting access to medical services, and food and other such goods. And most importantly, the key outcome, of course, is that these individuals should be resettled, that is, sent to some safe haven after they've been greeted into, say, camps or into to refugee areas. They can then be resettled to the United States or anywhere across Europe and other countries around the world. So the UNHCR contacted me 2 years ago, as I said, just under 2 years ago, and asked me if I would help them do a review of their information collecting services. They didn't see anything overly controversial about the fact that they were collecting information on refugees. They just encountered some processing challenges. To put it simply, some of their data went missing. Some of their laptops had been stolen, possibly just for the computer itself, but there was a concern that possibly the laptops had been stolen for the data on the laptops. And so they wanted me and a couple of colleagues to travel around to a number of their missions, one in Southeast Asia and 5 camps in Eastern Africa, to review their practices and to look at the situation on the ground and advise them on what they should actually do. So here's some of the photographs I took. This is the World Food Program handing out food to some of the refugees. I believe this was in Ethiopia or in Djibouti at the time. And so, of course, you would think that the World Food Program doesn't want to give away food just to anybody. They want to be able to focus on the refugee community, because actually in some of these countries that we visited, nationals were keen to get access to some of the food that was being offered by the World Food Program, but the UNHCR and the World Food Program only wanted to give the resources and access to the resources to refugees. And so in order to enable this, in order to be able to segment populations, to identify there's a refugee community and there's a non-refugee community, the UNHCR developed a system about 6 or 7 years ago called Project Profile, which developed a system called Progress in the end. And Project Profile its purpose was to identify who the refugees were, centralize all the information on refugees within missions, and basically manage the entire refugee interaction with UNHCR and implementing partners such as the World Food Program, the Red Cross, and even local governments. is on this long quotation. They're saying this system will revolutionize the way we do things, because prior to Project Profile and the database that eventually emerged, everything was paper-based. They had a I saw one of their libraries in Malaysia, and it was meticulously maintained. It was almost like watching accountants do their work. It was so careful about which paper went to which file, and the filing system was remarkable. But then they decide, well, actually, in order to enable data sharing, in order so that the government of Kenya can actually know who the refugees are in Kenya, we should move to an electronic-based system. And so there was a variety of purposes for moving to an electronic-based system. They wanted to manage the registration process, because once you register a refugee, then that refugee has rights. You want to manage resettlement, because you need to interview the refugee once they've been granted those rights, find out that refugee has friends or family in other parts of the world, and then resettle that refugee elsewhere. You want to monitor against abuse, and this is a growing concern. There's a concern that if a refugee shows up at the UNHCR operations in Kenya and goes through the initial stages and gets rejected refugee status, that individual might then go to Ethiopia and try the process all over again. So the UNHCR was worried about having to do the same process twice. So they thought, why don't we keep a central database to prevent against this secondary irregular movement, as it's called, or re-registration. And they want to be able to fix large populations, be able, as I said, be able to tell the Red Cross, we have 60,000 refugees in this camp. Because it's actually quite difficult to do that. Refugee camps aren't, as you see them in movies, where there's these big barriers around them. It doesn't quite work that way, because the refugees often have to go out to do farming in order to sustain themselves. They need to graze with animals, and so they come and go all the time. It's actually quite hard, depending on the time of year or even the time of the month, to say how many refugees are in the camp. But if you're able to create a database of all the refugees at a given moment in time, and to do this repeatedly over, say, a year, you'll have a good estimate of the numbers of refugees in that camp. And you can reinforce verification procedures so you don't have fraudulent refugees, or you don't have Kenyan citizens trying to pretend that they're refugees in order to get access to food and services. You can keep track of you can monitor the delivering of assistance. You can actually issue ID cards. And this is very important. Refugees don't have passports. They don't have birth certificates. And so there are people without papers. And so if you issue them with papers saying you are a refugee, so recognizing the refugee gives them rights, but giving them with a piece of paper or a card that they could then show the local government saying, do not throw me in the jail, I actually have a refugee card, I'm recognized by the UNHCR as a refugee, and therefore I deserve the rights under international conventions. That's an incredibly empowering device. Whereas, as you can tell from my accent, I'm North American, and I live in Britain, the notion that an identity card or an entitlement card is a positive human rights document is actually quite controversial, but I understand elsewhere around the world they're viewed otherwise. And then there's the possibility of registration at borders or in emergencies. So again, if a refugee, particularly on the border of Somalia, that border is so porous, refugees often go home to come back to the camps, and they should be able to do so and have proof that they are indeed refugees and not new arrivals or suspected terrorists or other such concerns that may arise. So we spent about 6 weeks traveling around a number of the camps, watching how this registration system operated. And of course there's a database kept on a number of laptops in every mission, and one of the key ingredients was actually the use of biometrics. This is a biometric scanner, a fingerprint scanner, quite similar to the first generation scanners used in the US visit program. Now that the US visit program's moved to multiple fingerprints, there's a different type of scanner, but here it's single finger scanners used and connected to a laptop, and individuals would come and be fingerprinted as they are registered. So you ask their name, you ask their date of birth, which is not always known actually, and the name sometimes varies and it doesn't fit the alphanumeric system on a number of these old-fashioned databases. And so you collect the fingerprints and you store this all in that central data in the local databases, and at the end of the night the UNHCR staff would go back to their own headquarters just outside of the camps and try to bring all the data from all the various laptops together and synchronize them into a single database. So let's look at the specific biometric system. These photos are intentionally blurred. It's not just I'm a bad photographer, but I also didn't want to disclose personal information to refugees in this presentation in my research. But the system would be able to identify individuals based on their fingerprints. So they show up after they've been registered. They show up the next day in order to get access to a food stamp card. And so that the individual then gets fingerprinted, and that fingerprint's verified against the entire database. So the fingerprint's taken by the software. There's actually 2 fingerprints taken, both from the index fingers. Sometimes the index finger might not actually be available in case it's actually been chopped off in some situations or damaged in other situations. So they could possibly take other fingers, but generally it's the 2 index fingers taken and stored in the central database. And so every time that individual comes back, all they got to do, they don't have to show a card, they don't have to show anything. Put the finger down, get scanned, look up their identity database and get all their personal information back. Very interesting and effective system. Or so you would think. The system, when we actually decided to look at it in detail, and this was the first time that it was actually looked at in detail. The system had gone live in 2004, but it was only last summer, it was the first time it was actually tested. It's because I asked, have you ever tested it? And UNHCR said, well, actually, no. So we decided to try it out, and in fact, the system was lousy. It was a system that was designed for building access control. Like in the building I was just in a little bit earlier this evening, there's a fingerprint scanner to let you in to the building. That's a vastly different system from, say, the US visit system or from a police fingerprinting system. This type of system used by the UNHCR is an off-the-shelf, cheap, and wholly ineffective system. But they were pretty much compelled to use this system because UNHCR receives money from donor governments. And sometimes these governments say, look, we're giving you money on the condition you use it for the following project. And one of the donor governments said, you must use this money to set up a fingerprinting system. And lo and behold, we have a company in our country that can build this fingerprinting system for you, and so therefore you must use this. It was a completely wrong fingerprinting system. Even the European Union officials who fingerprint refugees said, why are you using such a silly little system? It doesn't scale, it doesn't work for this type of environment. But UNHCR didn't know any better when they deployed this system. They thought they were on the leading edge. They didn't realize they were just using a sophisticated system to get into buildings in order to fingerprint hundreds of thousands of refugees, if not 20 million refugees around the world, is what they hope to do one day. And it had never been tested in the field. So I decided to test it with a few colleagues where we invited refugees. They volunteered, we didn't force them. They volunteered, they came in, gave us their fingerprints, and we scanned it against the system to see if their fingers were in the system, if the system could identify them, how long it took to get their fingerprints, and the results were disastrous. The UNHCR never questioned the integrity of the system, so they thought whatever results they got back from the system were accurate. But when we tested it, we found error rates that could reach as high as 70–80%. They haven't acted on that yet, so this system's actually still deployed in the field. Let's move away from the technology and look at the political issues involved. In some of the UNHCR environments, it's not actually UNHCR staff collecting information on the refugees. The ideal environment for UNHCR is actually that their staff are not at all involved in the management of the refugees, in the registration of the refugees. They would prefer if the national government was doing that. So in this case, this is a photo from Djibouti, where earlier that day they were bringing refugees from the camps to fingerprint them in the city to send them back to the camps. And she's not actually a UNHCR member of staff, she's a Djiboutian government member of staff. So now you have a registration system that's actually immediately available to a number of people, not just the small confines of UNHCR. And then other agencies want to have access to this information. So the World Food Program, for instance, was very eager to get access to this database so that they could make sure that when somebody showed up for food, that they would get fingerprinted right there and right then to make sure that this individual really is a refugee and not some national trying to cheat the system. So that immediately causes some political challenges, and so we also identified the fact that there were some databases that had gone missing. We found that some of the UNHCR staff would travel around the country with the laptops. They would take the laptops home and use those laptops to watch DVDs or surf the internet. But these laptops actually had all this really, really important information about refugees, including medical histories, including, in the case of some disastrous cases, rape histories, violence histories, and other such forms of information. Then you have to ask the question, who are the custodians? If UNHCR is not actually always operating the system, who actually owns the system? And so some of the governments, so when we land at the mission, one of the first things we do is we go meet the government officials. And in some circumstances, UNHCR isn't sharing the information with the national government. In other circumstances, they are. And the national governments who weren't getting access to the data were really angry at UNHCR, saying, how dare you collect information on people in our country and not give us access to that information? And UNHCR doesn't have much of a legal leg to stand on. They can't continue to keep on saying, no, you can't have access to this information, particularly when the country next door, you actually have the government staff collecting the information to put on UNHCR databases to then hand back to the government at some point. Then you have to ask the question, who else should have access? Should WFP have access? Should the Red Cross have access? Should other governments around the world have access? And in fact, when we interviewed the refugees and asked them, who do you think has access to this data that UNHCR is collecting, the refugees actually believed that UNHCR was sending this data back to the governments they were fleeing from, because UNHCR had never told them what was happening in this information, which is a basic step in other countries to actually let citizens know, let individuals know what is the purpose for information collection and who is actually being shared with it. But then you get to the cultural issues. Here is the interpreter taking the hand of a woman in one of the camps, and in this case, this was in Ethiopia, and basically grabbing her finger and plopping it down on the scanner. In some cultures, this would be considered invasive. If somebody did that to me right now, I would probably want to hit them, unless they were a cop, of course. That's the kind of scene you expect that to happen in. But you don't expect a translator to grab your finger and throw it down, grab your other finger and throw it down. And so there were some cultural concerns about the fact that men were doing this to women when their husbands weren't around. And then, of course, there are concerns when this happens to children. UNHCR official policy is that they will only fingerprint children above the age of 7. But their policy on the ground is, if they have fingers, they will be fingerprinted. I saw a 3-month-old baby being fingerprinted. And so I don't know how well you can see that, but the kid doesn't seem very happy about this happening. Now, we shouldn't read too much into this. The kid doesn't know what's wrong with fingerprinting. The kid sees a red hot light and being forced to put the finger down by, again, the translator, forcing the finger down, and so the kid, of course, is crying. As one UNHCR staff member said, that could be anything. The kids cry for just about anything in those environments when you register them. It's a tense environment, it's a hot day, you're out in the field, it's a very difficult operating environment. Of course kids are crying, so you shouldn't take this too seriously. But there is something to be said about the fact that babies are being fingerprinted. Now, UNHCR says we have to fingerprint people however young as they come, because one of the biggest challenges in refugee camps is the management of food. And they say that what often happens is that families share children for registration purposes. So if one family is going to get registered, they're going to get all the children in the neighborhood to come and be registered as that family. And then the next day, another family gets registered, all the kids will go to that family. So the registration cards actually say, okay, this family consists of 40 members, so feed them accordingly. So UNHCR said, we must stop this trading of children, so we must fingerprint as young as possible. They never questioned the ethics of it, just as they never questioned the technological aspects of it. Can you actually fingerprint children? Do their fingerprints change? And the answer is yes. Kids' fingerprints change dramatically in the first 7 to 10 years of their lives, essentially. And UNHCR never took the issue of privacy particularly seriously. They just figured, look, refugees don't care about these issues. And so we met with the refugees without leading them along. We asked them some very simple questions about their personal information. And we were actually shocked to see that refugees did understand privacy issues. We asked, who does the information belong to? And they said, it's our information. It's the refugees' information. It doesn't belong to somebody else. It actually belongs to the refugees. And when asked specific questions, they were very concerned about their use of information. But they weren't afraid to be fingerprinted because they saw it as the key gateway for them to be registered. And to be registered is when you get protected. And when you get protected, everything follows from that. You get your card, you get your food, you get resettled. So they would go through anything they had to go through in order to get that registration. So they're happy to be fingerprinted. They're happy for all this information to be collected because following from that, they get protection. But we did notice that somehow the culture of UNHCR was changing based on the use of this system, where if somebody couldn't be registered, if their fingers were harmed that day, immediately UNHCR staff figured these were fraudsters. If a child's fingerprint couldn't be verified, immediately UNHCR staff said this child must have been borrowed from another family. They became data-centric or system-centric. It was no longer, these are refugees that we must hear their stories, collect their stories, put it into a database so that we can remember this in the future. It was more, well, if they don't fit the system, therefore they must be fraudulent. And that was they acknowledged that there were some concerns about how the staff were treating and viewing refugees as a result. Technologically, though, is this system a step forward? It actually absolutely is. This is the old registration system in one of the camps, filing cabinets. And the weekends, they lock up the systems and everybody goes to the compound. So these filing cabinets could easily be opened, data copied, and all of that. But there is something about centralizing electronic data, digital data, because it can be shared more easily. This information cannot be shared with the government easily. It cannot be shared with foreign governments very easily. But you put it into a central data, you put it into a database in laptops in a digital format, that type of information can be shared far easier. And technologically, as we said, fingerprinting doesn't work particularly well. At least not that system. But across the board, fingerprinting is problematic. This woman is probably the most popular person in one of the camps now, because when we tested the system on her, it couldn't read her fingers. So she could register as many times as she wanted. And so now I'm sure many people want to be her family member and come and re-register so she can get as many cards as possible. And she knew this all along. She always knew the system never recognized her. But the UNHCR staff did not know. It was only when we tested the system and I pointed out to the UNHCR staff that this woman could be registered multiple times and we wouldn't know. They were shocked. But all the refugees in the entire community, they knew that the system didn't work. Why did news take so long to travel that way? To travel upwards to the UNHCR. And there are ethical issues that come into play when it comes to granting people access based on biometric data. Granting people access to services based on biometric data. Here's a case just from yesterday, or Monday actually, where a Chinese woman who had been thrown out of Japan, because Japan has a similar system as the US government where they fingerprint all visitors. She'd been thrown out of Japan, but they had taken her fingerprints, but she wanted to get back in, so she got her fingerprints surgically altered. For $15,000 in China, they surgically altered her fingerprints, and she was able to re-enter Japan. And so there's a concern that a market in altering fingerprints might actually emerge. But more importantly, what we had found was when some refugees were turned away because of their fingerprints, they would start harming themselves. They'd start chopping up their fingers. This actually happened in the United Kingdom in one of the compounds for asylum seekers. A number of asylum seekers started chopping their fingers up in order to conceal or change their fingerprints. So there are these second order, these side effects that actually might emerge as a result of the use of fingerprinting. So technologically, the challenges are that it was an untested system, and there was this blind faith that, oh, there's a flashy red light, it's got to work. We put a finger down, the computer draws an image of the fingerprint, it looks like it looks how it works on television. And that's what all the staff were saying. Well, look, this is a fantastic system. It's just like what they have on CSI, the American TV show. And it was the wrong system, but the staff and the UNHCR never questioned whether it was the right system. They saw the money come from the donor, and the donor said, apply it to a company based in our country, and so the system was deployed. And even if they were using a better system, even if they were using a system as strong as, say, the US Visit system, US Visit works because you're being fingerprinted in a controlled environment, an airport, where the US government controls the lighting, they control the heat, they control all the conditions. In a refugee camp, we were fingerprinting people in broad daylight, we were fingerprinting them, well, very bright lights, but also in windy environments, in sandy environments. Fingers were often very dirty. It was an untidy environment. CSI and the US government, they operate in very, very clean environments. UNHCR doesn't, but they never questioned these ideas. They never thought that it wouldn't work in their environment. And so we were asked to write up a report that summarized the risks of the system that they were deploying. And we identified two key risks. First, a risk to the refugees, and then second, a risk to UNHCR. First, we said the danger of data falling into the wrong hands could result in persecution, discrimination, or even imminent threat to liberty and life. And that there are a lot of warlords operating, particularly along the in the region of Somalia. And if they were able to get access to this data, it would be incredibly valuable for people trafficking, for just asserting control over people. And when, I'm not saying that computers did go missing in that region, but I can say computers did go missing in other operations of UNHCR. We don't know who has access to that data, and we don't know how they're using that data, but it could actually lead to threats on people's lives. And these are the most vulnerable people on Earth. It's possible we're making them more vulnerable by collecting this information in this way. And there's a risk to the organization. There's a risk to UNHCR that they may actually fail in doing the one thing that they're tasked to do, which is to protect refugees. If news gets out that there's a major breach of their data, and a foreign government can get access to this data all of a sudden, that's going to hurt confidence in UNHCR. It's going to hurt their funding stream, it's going to hurt their international reputation, and it might actually, I'm not saying that refugees read newspapers around the world and decide whether or not to go to UNHCR or go to the Red Cross accordingly, but there are concerns that refugees will lose confidence in the whole refugee process. And so we identified a number of dangers, of data being lost, being stolen by profiteers or human traffickers. And already in one operation, they had found that a government employee had been hired by had been paid off by organized crime to falsely register people and to change registration data. Again, because UNHCR staff don't necessarily have control over their own systems. Often it's other organizations that have access to it. And other the host governments often want access to this data, foreign governments want access to this data, and when lost, disastrous things can happen. But there's so much momentum behind the system. The system had only been deployed in about 9 countries as a test system, although it had never been tested. They just started deploying it. And once other missions heard that there was this fingerprinting system and this database system, every other mission wanted access to that. They said, oh, we have all these problems with refugees. We want this system that will solve our problems. But when we spoke to these other missions and said, what kind of problems do you have? They'd say, oh, we have a problem with refugees getting access to food. We have a problem with repatriating refugees and all these other problems. And we had to convince them that the system wouldn't solve any of those problems. Not because the system didn't work, but because the system just wasn't designed to solve the problems that some of the missions had. But they still wanted that technology. They wanted the flashy red lights. They wanted to simplify what they saw as simplified processes of registration, when in fact it actually caused bottlenecks and a slight level of chaos. And so the side effects of this entire system, as I mentioned before, is that there was unrealistic and ever-changing set of expectations, but there was also this biometric registration-centric view. Again, if somebody couldn't be fingerprinted, they must be fraudulent. If there was a problem in the registration system, the refugee must be at fault. It was a complete reversal in the thinking of what was the task of the system, what is the task of UNHCR. So, how do you fix this? Not easily. Not easy, because UNHCR operates in a very complicated environment. They don't have laws. UNHCR is not in control of laws. They can't follow international standards because there are no international standards for them to follow. And they are always operating in foreign jurisdictions. So the Ethiopian government has a law. UNHCR doesn't have a law. So Ethiopian government laws apply to the operations of UNHCR in Ethiopia. Same in Djibouti and same in all the other countries. Then you have foreign governments who want access to this data. So, before you know it, and actually it started occurring already, the US government has started saying that they're not going to resettle any refugees unless they can get access to DNA and biometric data. So they're going to have to set up a gateway for regular sharing of information with the US government. And I guarantee you, once the US government gets that kind of deal, every European government is going to want the exact same deal. They're going to want regularized access to all this information. Another big challenge, the population of people who are being monitored have no idea. They're unaware, they're uninformed, they're not told why their data is being collected. They're just saying this is a gateway to them actually being protected. And they're relatively unconcerned as a result. They think, well, okay, the UNHCR is going to share it with whoever they want as long as I get recognized as a refugee and I eventually get resettled. They aren't overly concerned or aware of all the risks that might actually occur. And then on top of that, even if they were concerned, who would they appeal to? There's no regulator. There's no national ombudsman. There's no watchdog organization they can appeal to. They can't ask UNHCR for their data, and UNHCR would hand over the data so they can vet this data. There is no such structure within UNHCR. And UNHCR in these missions is not some cohesive whole. It's not just UNHCR staff. As I mentioned before, it's government staff, it's other organization staff, all having access to this information and all being able to change this information. So it's not this nice, neatly contained organization. And on top of that, they're poor. UNHCR is an incredibly poor organization. They often complain that of all the UN agencies, they have the worst PR. You know, in movies, you'll see the World Food Program getting a high profile. UNICEF gets a high profile. But UNHCR doesn't get international recognition for what it is they do. Although recently they're quite proud that Angelina Jolie has taken on the task of being an ambassador for UNHCR. But they have limited resources, and so again, this causes a problem. The government says, we'll give you money, sure, but you must do something that we want. And that the time's going to come where they're going to have to do DNA registration as a result, because some foreign government's going to give them money and say, okay, invest in our company, in our country to do DNA collection. And there'll be no questioning of whether or not the system is actually useful or whether it does the task it's supposed to. But I think the UN's recognizing the fact that there are problems. The UN and all the UN agencies know that they are collecting more and more information, and serious problems might actually emerge from this collection of information. And that's why the Director of General Legal Division of the UN's Office of Legal Affairs recently said, actually it's in 2005, said that perhaps the UN has to follow other countries, particularly European countries' examples, and set up offices and regulators for information collection and information processing. And so that one day refugees and citizens of countries around the world can actually seek for redress when errors occur over their most sensitive personal information. So, sorry if the presentation went all over the place. Again, this is the first time I'd actually sat down and tried to encapsulate everything that we'd experienced over the past 2 years. And we're still ongoing with the UNHCR. We're going to help them come up with the next version of their database registration system so that it has stronger privacy controls and security controls too, to make sure that access controls are stronger. But we're not going to be able to turn back the tide on the biometric revolution. They have gotten the bug. They're excited about fingerprinting. They believe, despite everything we've said to them, they believe it will solve problems that they haven't even yet identified. So we're not going to be able to push that back, but at least you can try to correct the processing and the systems and the technologies around that over the years to come, if the money exists. Thank you very much.
Actually, Gus is going to be leaving us in about 30 minutes, so it might be a good time to have some questions before we move on to the next speaker, if there are any questions. I actually have one or two myself. One is actually a technical one, and then the other is more of a philosophical one. You talked about these two generations of the fingerprint readers. What is it, technically speaking, that characterizes that difference, aside from the three, there's multiple fingers? Is there something in the...
Actually, really, it's just a number of fingers. When the U.S. visit program began, some human rights groups told the U.S. government it's wrong to be collecting fingerprints and treating foreigners as criminals. And the U.S. government said, no, hey, hold on, we're only collecting 2 fingers. It's not like a fingerprinting system in the police stations. But then we said, well, actually, that's not good enough. You can't collect just 2 fingerprints because there's not enough unique data to identify the 300 million plus people that visit the United States. And the U.S. government said, no, nothing to worry about. 3 years later, after spending about $7 billion, they realized, oh, we don't have enough fingers for unique data, so we'll move to the 10 fingerprint system. So it was purely a technical decision, just to have more unique data.
Oh, thanks. And then the other question was about, sort of inspired by this woman who came back multiple times as sort of fraudulence, which, well, I guess I could put it in the form of a question: does she see that as fraud, or does she see that as a part of actually a straightforward way to gather resources for a family?
Absolutely.
And then, do you see a kind of creation of refugees through the fact that this documentation process gives them rights, which of course they want? Do you see more people coming into the refugee system than you would have had before?
Absolutely. So I'll do the second one first. The system was set up to try to reduce the number of claimed refugees. They thought that once they started fingerprinting people, the fake refugees would leave. In fact, the problem's grown worse, particularly, let's use the example of Kenya, where a lot of Kenyan citizens who are also of Somali descent, or because the border is so porous, so you just happen to have been born in a different part, you happen to be born in Kenya, but you are Somalian. They are seeking refugee status, and they believe they deserve refugee status, but they've been fingerprinted for the Kenyan ID card system. And so every now and then the Kenyan government comes into UNHCR and says, we want to do a comparison of our 2 fingerprint databases to make sure that Kenyan citizens aren't trying to be refugees and get access to all this food. So absolutely, there is that pulling factor. And not everybody wants to be a refugee registered in this system because they also know it doesn't work. In the case of so refugees have a different, you're entirely right, they have a different perception of what is abuse. And I'm not trying to paint all the UNHCR staff as angry people or trying to keep bad people out. Actually, there's a number, I'd say it's split down 50-50, the people that we worked with. Many of them say, we should let everybody come in, however many times they want. And they were actually fighting off the World Food Program, because they were telling World Food Program wanted access to the biometric data so they could prevent all these bad people from getting food. And UNHCR is asking, why? What's wrong with giving people access to food? And World Food Program says, well, it's an abuse of resources. There's going to be a lot of people showing up. And some of the UNHCR staff are saying, well, how much more? We're talking about what, 1%, 2% more? Is that really a problem so significant we need to fingerprint everybody and share all this information just to get that drop? And by the way, these people are hungry. You're not going to get, middle-class fat people like me showing up for food. It's going to be noticeable who wants access to food, and should we really be turning people away? So there is that concern within the organization that refugees, if they get turned away from one place, they should go somewhere else. But the system will one day prevent them from doing that. People in these desperate measures should try every possible mechanism in order to get access to services.
Any other comments or questions? None at all? Okay. All right, then without delay, we'll move on to local better. Thanks a lot, guys. And then we can expect Hert to burst through the door at any moment and wonder why we started without him.
So, my English is not as good as one of Gas, and our presentation is not as good as the one of Gas, but my goal today now is to try to make the link between our presentation that Paul will finish up and Gas presentation. It seems that there is a link. I will have a different approach, more like political scientist approach. So I raised two questions, the question of power relation and the question of equality. Why? All along this autumn series, we have seen several topics and concepts coming back. And I was struck by some of them, and one it was protection, how to protect people, and what does it mean. Another one was including, what does it mean to include, and the opposite, what does it mean to exclude people. And how about empowering? We see some of those elements also in Gas presentation, when you say that the recursive identifiers is a way to empower people, to explain them or to show them their rights to go and have food and so on. You are trying to sell in that as empowering. Okay, so why focusing on third country? And why focusing on first country or Western country, if you want to say that? I think that it's important to come back to third countries and to what is not considered Western. Because for a while, most of scientific debate focused on those topics on Western. And within Western society, on immigrants. And why? First of all, because the first measure were aiming especially at immigrants or asylum seeker, and you just think about the Eurodac database that was collecting fingerprinting of asylum seekers, and you think about the securitization process of immigration and asylum seeker in both Atlantic side. But I think that there's something important in coming back to the history that we have with non-Western countries, because we see that biometrics are not a novelty, that the UK first established fingerprinting for colonies, that the recourse to bertillonnage in France, it was considered to the exclusion, to the class that were considered dangerous. And so I think that it is important to see how fingerprinting has been used before, what the value of biometrics, and sometimes what are the practices that were put in place. And if you think that, for example, Japan was using during its colonial period fingerprinting as an anti-guerrilla tactic, you think a lot about how the same instrument could be used in different perspectives and with different aims. And second point, why it's important to think about non-Western countries, because as Gas has shown some practices already happening there. So some data is already spread, are collected, stored, exchanged abroad. And we want those data, and Gas was speaking about DNA data, but most of EU countries and member states are already asking for DNA data in case of family reconstruction. I don't know, family reunification. So I think it's important, but why it's important also to come back to more Western practice. And the second slide, because here also we see an increased use of biometrics. Gas has already spoken about the US visit system, that is a very huge system. I think it's the biggest fingerprint system of the world in this very moment. And because you see the use of biometrics in passport and ID more and more. And you see also in the EU other systems like the Visa Information System and the Schengen Information System 2, second generation, that have still to be implemented, but they are born with biometrics inside. So they are born and they are going to be run around biometrics. And then why? Because you see also an increased exchange of processing of personal data, and those data are not only law enforcement data in specific case or immigration data, but are also commercial data. Okay, and if we focus on the mobility, we have a lot of systems in place. We have the passenger name records, that is this agreement with the US and the EU, on which I will come back, with the US, but also with the two countries, that is Canada and Australia. We have a proposal of PNR in Europe. We have an already active project in the UK that is called the Semaphore Pilot Project, and that is part of the e-border project. Then you have already advanced passenger information systems, both in Europe, that is border control and immigration control, but also security control. And then you see the insecurity continuum that is put in place, and the API system in the US. And then you have to come back to biometrics, PROM-like agreements. PROM was a small international agreement to exchange or to provide exchange of DNA and biometrics data between a European country. Now you have bilateral agreement with the US. So you have a momentum for that. And so what all those tell us? I think that the point is that it's no more only migration, but we have to focus from another point of view, that is the point of human mobility and human life and population management. So it's no more focusing only on migrants, it's focusing on everyone to select, include and exclude in every moment who is allowed to have some benefit or some right and who is not allowed to that. We have also the presentation of Health and Skilled, if I'm not wrong, that was speaking about interest, the growing interest of tax service in that. Why? Because it's a way to restructuring the welfare states. So you can exclude more easily who is not allowed or charged with having a specific social advantage. And so I think that it's important to see what's happening in Western countries also, because it applies also to non-Western countries. And to come back to PNR, passenger name record, what are the power relations in passenger name record? First of all, how it works. You have people buying tickets, so those data are commercial data that are registered to airlines, and airlines generally used to outsource those service to big database. So you have the Department of Homeland Security of the US able to access those data, collect those data, and process. You have two kinds of processing. One first kind of processing is to screen those data against established list of like known or suspect terrorists or no-fly list and so on. And the second, more interesting kind of processing, that is process those data against pattern profile. So there's someone that established what is then processing commercial data. And this extract of two national strategies, if we can consider a European Union Stockholm program as sort of national strategy, but it's amazing to see how similar they are. You have screening of passengers, the use of biometrics, the idea of shared terrorist watch list, and in general data in the Homeland Security strategy. And then in the European Union, you have the idea to establish an entry-exit system that is not so different from the US visit, to create this idea of fast-track registered traveler, and to establish a traveler authorization system that is very similar to the electronic system of traveler authorization that has been already established in the US and that you have already to fill if you want to enter. And finally, the idea to promote this automatic border control. So what have in common all those measures? That they try to be preventive and they try to discriminate all the time in advance between mala fide and bona fide travelers. And that's the point that I want to make. What is the possibility of power relation within a system in which the main scope and the main goal is the one to exclude someone on the basis of not already done, but on what is possible? I think that this brings us to the classical question of privacy, of non-discrimination and presumption of innocence. All of them have some limits, as we have seen, but I think that they are the crucial question for the idea of mala fide and bona fide. Okay, I can go on for the presentational part of that. Okay, the question so that Paul would like to introduce is if borders are getting close to you, are borders getting more consumer friendly? First question. And last year we worked a little bit with a comparison of EU and US privacy system, and one of the first outcome was that, for example, non-US citizen or permanent residents has no privacy, US Privacy Act guarantee, so they have no legal and judicial redress, so they have less guarantees than other individuals. And at the same time, you still have planes that are sent back or retarded, and you have individuals that are refused entry. And third element, error rates are still a reality. But compensation is not a reality. So the idea of Paul is that if you get stopped, you will win a lot of money if there is an error. But we have seen that, for example, in the works of the high-level contact group, that is a work that has been established between experts in privacy and law enforcement issues in EU and US, the question of compensation has not been really discussed and addressed. You have this open issue that is the issue of legal redress, because in the US you have just an administrative redress and not a legal redress, and no compensation, or very, very small compensation, and how to establish a compensation if you have no legal redress, how you are entitled to ask for that. Second question, are those measures more citizen-friendly, in the sense that I will take two, individual-friendly on one side and citizen in the sense of right-friendly? And no, again, because you have no judicial redress, so you cannot defend yourself in a court in the US. You have a relative opacity of the effective working and efficiency of those security apparatuses. On one side, you don't know how they work. You don't know even how they are being established. And for example, today there is this big debate in the US about the release of travel security authority rules. The fact that have been released has been considered an attempt against national security. And you don't know what are the outcomes. And then you come back to the idea that all citizens and all individuals have to be controlled, because at the beginning most of those measures were justified in Europe, not against immigration, not against organized crime, but against international terrorism. And finally, you do not have any report of their efficiency in terms of anti-terrorism. When you have reports, for example, from the UK Home Office concerning the semaphore project, that is the PNR European project, you have only some report concerning smuggling, some organized crime and small crime, like tobacco smuggling and so on. So you don't know what is a high level of efficiency or not. And then, yes, in the US, for example, you have a legal definition of what is data mining, that is the processing or part of the processing of personal data, where to start, of personal data against patterns, and you have a second very interesting thing, that is the system of records notification, that is the possibility to know how a system works by law, but how still individuals can check the efficiency of effective processing and how can hear their voice if something goes wrong. I think that Paul will tell us how. No?
Continue.
No, please. I think that there is the part on consumer law that...
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for the relative chaotic approach. But we figured out that at the end of a series of lectures, you have time for a vision. And what we regret, I have to get rid of this first, yeah. So this is my working habit sometimes. But we thought at the end of a lecture series, hearing a lot of shifts and evolutions, often detrimental for human rights, there is time for another sound, another view on things. There is time for a view that is constructive. And we think with the issue of mobility, globalization, and the shifts with regard to borders, but biometrics, they make the body a border. Huh? So there is we used to have clear-cut borders, physical borders, but today the problem gets more complex. And there's a lot of literature on these transformations, often very negative, very dark in tone. And we just ask ourselves the questions, can we make something better out of some of these evolutions? And the answer is yes. So we devised a scheme of mobility that is both consumer-friendly and citizen-friendly. And we make a distinction between both. Now, we're not used to that distinction, but in political theory it's a classical one. And I believe that an antagonism is not necessarily always there, but I believe that both perspectives are complementary. And what we see today is that the issue of border controls about mobility is defined by fear, is defined by the perspective of those that want to exclude, those that want to control. And technology, what most authors do is to refer to these technologies that modern border checks imply and then draw negative conclusions. And we think that it is possible to do it in a different way. So about consumer friendliness, I think that consumer law is about correcting power relations between the consumers and the producers. And consumer law has been born out of the insight that general answers are needed to redress, to accommodate very specific annoyances in this relationship between consumers and producers. And consumer law is based on very simple insights. It is not based on precise calculations of loss. It is not based on clear-cut rules to allocate liability. It is actually based on the insight that the best conflict is a resolved conflict. So in a lot of ways, the consumer law does the contrary of what law does. Because what law generally does is to be very precise in its analysis of liability schemes, is to be, with regard to agency, to be very prudent in allocating liability and so on. And consumer law, hence, has another approach, and we think that this approach is a very strong one. It is an approach of generosity, an approach based on the instinct and on the insight that complex power mechanisms stand in the way of individual justice, and it's actually based on a gentleman's agreement between consumers and producers. So where would this consumer-like perspective bring us with regard to border control? It would bring in the person that is the central in the mobility, that is the one who is moving. So what we see now is that the issue of border controls is defined by those safeguarding the borders. But, and those who are actually transgressing borders are often seen as the problem. Now, I think that there should be a responsive relationship between those two parties, and this responsive relationship can bring us better results than the current relationship that as I see it when transgressing borders myself. And what am I thinking of? Because that's the question that I see burning in your eyes. We discussed, everybody wants to know, where is he going to? Well, now, take the PNR scheme. This is a scheme that wants to heighten security of passengers on airplanes. It is a scheme, it's a technology borrowed from insurance logic. So insurance companies use profiling and other schemes to detect good and bad clients, and it is a scheme, an analysis of potential danger applied to those buying airplane tickets. Now, am I against PNR-based technologies? That is, the answer is complex. Yes, the presumption of innocence is reversed. Yes, everybody, all citizens are treated as if they were suspect. And yes, it is imposing a control mechanism on something that should be not deserve control in all individual cases. But on the other hand, I think that the people taking those planes can be that it is possible to enter into a dialogue with them. Yeah. And there could be a bargaining moment in that dialogue. So do I have a problem with an error rate? Do I have a problem with a system that says this person might be a suspect, so this plane has to come back? It depends. I wouldn't like a scheme with error rates that go beyond the acceptable. But granted that these systems predict and can fail in their prediction, I do accept an error rate. And this brings me then in another position. If we all realize that these systems have an error rate, then cannot we accommodate ourselves to that possibility? And the answer could be yes. I think that people within reasonable limits could agree to undergo these screenings based on profiles, based on accumulation of data and data mining, if they were treated in a respectful way. And then this brings me to compensation and legal redress. What I don't hear in these stories is redress. What I don't hear in these stories is paying back those people that lose enormous amounts of time, that lose enormous amounts of business opportunities and others when the plane has to go back. So then that's where I suggest some improvement. We should be more generous while using sloppy technologies. If these technologies are acceptable in a security perspective, but are sloppy because they predict and they're not based on certainty, then we should depart from that. And I think that a posteriori compensating people for errors that have occurred in a system of which we know that it has a serious error rate could be a more consumer-friendly perspective. And I think that states today want too much at once. They want these technologies, but they do not want to compensate when these errors occur. And I think that's very unfriendly. And I think that we're all ready to sustain a system with errors that compensates in a generous way people that were identified unrightly by the system. So what I actually propose in this perspective is taking these technologies that are based on prediction and have an error rate serious. They're not. They do fail. They are based on uncertainty. And if this happens, then do not hide it. Then do not shy away, but come out and defend that system and be generous in your compensation scheme. So what I would like is to be in a plane going to New York and being in a plane that is refused access rights to American airspace. Because then I would be forced with the other passengers to go back, but I would receive tons of dollars. Now that would be a nice perspective. Yay, they erred. Yay, they sent me back. Yay, I'm touching all this money. That would be, and suddenly something that is dark becomes much more playful. And this, and the playfulness is what is needed in the security discourse, and it's totally lacking. So I would like a realpolitik in security debates could bring in this idea of respect of and could help us in creating a more consumer-friendly perspective on these technologies, as long as we want it. So this is a first perspective that we think is important. Are these systems that we are applying, did we conceive them in a multi-stakeholder perspective? And I think the answer is no. A lot of secrecy around those systems, a lot of what I would call unopen to dialogue behavior, and I think that's not the way to go. We should, if we want them, should learn to live with them, but then acknowledge the strong points and the weak points. And I think governments do really bad in acknowledging the weak points. So I think mobility and border control could be enriched by adopting a consumer perspective. And this means, to be very concrete, that you don't have to argue for loss of time, loss of opportunities, but that you get granted, let's say, $5,000 every time your plane has to go back. Yeah? That's the idea of consumer law. We will not argue about the precise damage, but we will compensate you in a generous way. So that's the way ahead, and that's the way, a mature way of dealing with technologies based on preemption and predictions. And I think that governments are not ready for that kind of view on things, but we could help them. We could help them by funding institutions that award these compensations, and we could be helping by teaching them a bit some of the lessons of consumer law. Now that's only one perspective. A second perspective, because that would then be on the level of citizenship, a perspective that has some flaws in it. You would then accept almost every government intrusion at the condition that you are compensated afterwards. So that would not be a very critical position towards governments, and we should remain critical every time the government is developing something new. That is a citizen task, to think along with the government and to interrogate government. So what we would add to the consumer-friendly perspective is a citizen-friendly perspective. And again, I think that a lot of literature on mobility has a negative image of today's possibilities of technology. So there is a bias against the use made by governments of technology, and this bias is preventing us from seeing the good things. Now, again, what is he thinking about? So a citizen-friendly perspective is recognizing a citizen as a dignified subject of the state of the rule of law. Yeah? And that includes that we should recognize that this person, this consumer, acting as a citizen, has citizens' rights. Due process is one, defense rights are other ones. Now, what is happening today? We will travel. We do travel. So this is stressful. We pack. We yell at our children, at our wife, or somebody else. We are nervous. Trains might be late. We arrive at the airport, and then you have to pass all these kinds of security checks. If you want to fly into the United States, extra checks with a lot of uninteresting questions, a lot of questions that we actually do not like to respond. And then God will tell us, because we don't know who, somebody will tell us if we can go or not go. But when are we receiving this message? We are receiving this message in a situation of extreme vulnerability. We're actually traveling, this is stressful, we're not at home, we have our luggage, we have a lot of things, we have a time schedule, we're in a hurry. So this is not a position for argument. It is a bad position. Now, what then do I prefer? I'm actually interested in the data that these governments, using that data, have upon me. And they don't have to give it to me, but they do take decisions on it. And their decision could be, you can't fly in. Now, what I would like, and that's what I call a citizen-friendly perspective, I just would like to know in advance, but not 10 minutes, but 3 days in advance, whether I will get green light or no. And then I'm in a much more comfortable position. I haven't packed, I can call my lawyer, I can organize my defense from home, and so on. And that is what it might be not much, but I think these are two useful elements to approach the use of new technologies and the use of new border control schemes in a much more convincing way. I would, since these preemptive technologies, since these technologies do result in a yes or no decision that you will hear before you actually take off. There is an interest for me in hearing about this yes or no one day before. So I don't see a state interest in keeping the yes or no message secret. There is no secrecy, because it is enough to take a plane and you will know what the US government thinks about you. Yeah? So I think that we should empower the traveling citizen, and allowing, and if border checks today, through the use of biometrics and other technologies, are now done in the home or on your body, then let's make the best out of it. Why can't I ask by a simple mail before taking off to the United States whether they will give me green light or no? Why waiting till the end? Why do I have to hear about this in Zaventem? So I think these are challenges, but they are seriously. I do think that new technologies based on preemptive strategies deserve a place under the sun, under strict conditions, and under accountability regimes. I don't think it is wise to reject them. But I do think that we should accommodate those technologies, and I see too, and perhaps there are many, many, many other possibilities to accommodate them in a more consumer and citizen-friendly regime. But this demands, first of all, that we start a non-aggressive dialogue with governments, and second of all, that governments become a bit more creative about the security technologies they're imposing on us. So that is actually the... I could also have brought a more learned lecture, but I thought after having so many lectures that it could be fun to have a more positive view on technology and on the possibilities of all those new regimes that they are applying on us. So thank you for listening, and again I'm sorry for being in late because I love Gus and I love Peter. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Paul. You look great in the robe, by the way. Yes. The floor is open. Gus and Vrije, you're also welcome to comment or question. Sure.
Yes, Professor Hert, I had a question about your suggestion. Isn't this a sort of introduction of a reintroduction to the visa system?
No.
So wouldn't that be at least a burden the size of a small filling in of the paper in the plane? Or having your biometric check on it? I mean, the result is the same, you cannot go. So.
Yeah, you should.
Visas are issued by the State Department, which is different from the Department of Homeland Security, which is different, surprisingly, from the department that does the data mining, which is Customs and Border Police. So one department might say, yes, you can have a visa, the other department might say, yeah, you can have a visa, but you can't come into the country. And that's how you had that situation where, 2 years after 9/11, the State Department had actually reissued visas for 2 of the hijackers in 9/11. These walls exist that would get in the way of that.
Yes, a system exists, and that is called the trade system of travel authorization. That was first applied by Australia and then moved to US. The problem is that just one more layer, in the sense that the fact that this is a frequently asked question of the ESTA, from the page of VHS, and if I'm approved through ESTA travel to the United States, does that mean I can enter the country? Not necessarily. In the sense that it's just one more layer. It's not the final green light. And so it's a not so expensive system to put just one more securitization layer to the process. So that's the point where I don't see exactly a citizen-friendly approach. And data are retained for 75 years. That is the second problem. That is a lot of time.
Yeah, well, these are, of course, data protection critiques that I take very seriously. Yeah? So I do think that we should grow up with these technologies, and there should be a fine-tuning of checks and balances. But I do believe that it is possible to add checks and balances, and it is for us legal scholars to think along with the other experts, the human science experts, but also the technological experts. And my feeling is that we should, the old attitude, the old approach was to insert as much checks and balances before, yeah, to make these processes diligent, and so we have concentrated a lot on the performance of these technologies and on the way of inserting the checks and balances there. I have now another view. I think we should enrich that concern about good technologies, good functioning technologies, has its importance, but the lawyers know that you can as well add checks and balances afterwards. And it's that what we're losing out of sight. That you can actually accommodate sloppy technologies by generous compensation schemes. Yeah? So the one goes with the other. The better your controlling technology is, the less generous the compensation scheme has to be afterwards. So an effort to individualize in a careful way before should actually render immune justice and home affairs when they commit an error. And that's also in the human rights ideology. There's no established right to compensation whenever justice and home affairs breach your rights, and afterwards this wasn't proven necessary. So we have to be very careful, not making justice, the work of justice, completely impossible. We have to accept some infringements in our rights, but I think that we should open the discussion about compensation when government starts experimenting with very wild technologies, and I think PNR and others are wild. The same goes for biometrics. There is an error rate of some percentage, and there is always, then you actually accept errors. So let's discuss the errors. Let's not try not to see that errors would pop up, but let's address the errors. And if you really want the error in technologies, then take it as a man and be generous. And about the visa system, I do think we're returning to a visa system. Yeah, I think that we are indeed individualizing the old visa philosophy. That's one of the mechanisms. Yeah.
So, yes, sorry. I would also want to ask either Professor Hert or Mr. Hosein about the problem with the suggestion that you gave about letting people know 3 days before. I would see two major problems. The first one is the courts would be much more involved with people actually bringing up a lawyer. And I don't know whether Homeland Security would be happy about allowing the judiciary to interact so much in their field. Because I believe the reason why Homeland Security is working so well is because it is not letting them to see other areas of law or other areas of departments. And the second thing I fear is if I know 3 days ahead that I will be rejected, there will be a kind of way of somehow people trying to defraud the system by changing their appearances, changing the password, or at least attempting to change the password. So I would see there would be a lot of problems with maybe the suggestion.
Well, I'm not convinced. I think that's a very poor, that would be a very pitiful attitude. Because then that is what has kept, I think that, I don't see the difference really between a person hearing 3 days in advance that it will be rejected and then trying other schemes, and a person being rejected, go home and then try 3 days later again to fly. So I do think that we should come over this and take each other seriously. And what actually happens there is that you can, well, it's a long story, it's a vision on borders, but what characterized borders before? They were physical, you know where they were, and once you were there, you have no rights. If I move from France to Spain as a Belgian, and the Spanish police refused to let me in before, or subjected me to to far-going control, I had no rights. So I consider borders to be traditionally an area of non-law, non-droit. But the good thing about traditional borders were that you know that you were approaching them. Now in the modern border management, the border is everywhere. So the old bargain, I accept less rights, but I know where these places are, should be rearranged. And if borders are now everywhere, then a situation that you can be interpelled but have no rights is no longer tolerable. So border controls from now on should be taken into the legal area. We should, and so border controls should get banalized, should be subjected not any longer to politics and discretion, but to legal parameters. So I do think that we should get used to consulting a lawyer when border controls do not look prosperous. So I hope you feel where I'm going to. But,
yeah, please.
Yes, I had some remarks, but they're not quite structured well yet in my head. So I have some questions and some remarks. First is, well, I think it's a bit cynical. It's very pragmatic, but it's a bit cynical because, well, somewhere, somehow, I mean, we've seen in Mr. Hosein's presentation how, for example, the technology they were using was actually funded. Well, they were using it because using it was one of the
conditions for
the conditions for using it. So there's a sort of conflict of interest. Is that technology actually meant for what it is supposed to mean, or is it actually a way of returning money somewhere and making a little detour so that it seems clean and stuff?
But I do agree on that one. Huh? So I think governments today play with technology but don't pay the right price for it. They get it in suspected ways, they use it, and they don't pay the full price for it. And the full price should take into account the damage that you do to people's lives, consumers and citizens.
Yes, exactly. So in the first place, we can already ask the question whether this technology is actually legitimate. And by simply introducing this part of, well, if it's wrong, we'll give you money, we're going to make of a political issue, we're just going to put it onto the market, and it will not be a political issue anymore. So we'll just have to accept it, and I think that's very cynical. And
I call it playful.
Well, many cynical persons are quite playful, I must say. And I think that, well, when one comes to think of the whole purpose of democracies and dialogue and stuff, it's just a way to shut people up. You know what? Here's $5,000, shut up, the system's fine. And so there's no more questioning. On the other hand, if this technology is actually used and we're really trying to make it, to improve it in the name of security, is there not a risk that, well, since there will be these high stakes, because if they're wrong, you'll have to give money to people, then the security will go down because nobody wants to pay lots of money because you don't have, they won't just pay the $5,000 to the one who has been suspected because the whole plane came back. And so there might be 200, no, not 200, but 100 passengers who will all want $5,000. So maybe they'll say, well, what risks are we occurring? Maybe he will commit some crime, and we don't know what kind of crime. Maybe he'll be a terrorist, maybe he'll just rob a bank, etc. But the bank has insurance and will get its money back. Is it really worth to pay everyone that money? And so, even if, hypothetically speaking, we are thinking of the security of people, if we then, on the other hand, compensate by, a security measure is not, I don't think you can actually compare it to consumer-friendly measure because it's two completely different domains. And so, well, this was my second remark, and with the question, is there not a risk that security, even if it is, well, the purpose will not be followed because of this risk of money?
I should wish my unstructured thoughts were so structured.
May I reply? Huh? I have, I do think that what I want to know about PNR is, after 5 years of applying it, give me the numbers. Honest. Has it helped? Are you satisfied? What is missing? How much longer do I have to wait? Tell me about it. Inform me about this technology. And I do assume that I give them some credits. So I'm actually ready to go along with security measures. But that's what I call the accountability sheet. If within 5 years it is not proven that these things help, then let's stop them. And what we see today is there was this fuss about bottles that you could bring in or not. What we are encountering, and this has to do with consumer interest, is that what we're seeing that today they're abandoning the idea, but they don't know when. But apparently it was a bad idea. It was not speeding up things, on the contrary, and people had to throw away entire bottles of water, whiskey and whatever. And I bought, in the old scheme, if you wanted a tax reduction for whiskey flying from Belgium to the United States and then coming back, then you had to buy the bottle in Belgium, fly to the United States and come back, and then you had the tax reduction. I did this. I like whiskey. So I got in Brussels, I bought a bottle of whiskey, they wrapped it up in a bag, then they put a stamp on it or something, and I carried it with me to the United States, and then I said, what is this bottle? I said, it's my bottle of whiskey. And so I managed to get through, but apparently I was the only one having done that. And then when flying back, I had an enormous problem in explaining that this Belgian whiskey bottle was actually bought in Belgium to get the tax advantages and so on and so on and so on. So what I do think is that the consumer perspective is a nice perspective for belly bottom emotions. So I think we should take use of that. I think the human rights discourse has its limits, and I think we should strategically use other discourses. The interest of the child, it's a good one. If you don't like biometrics, talk about children. Or the consumer interest, that's a very powerful perspective. So let's use it. And so it is not cynical. If they have a good case for security based on about PNR, based on some arguments, then let us use it. So I would, the legitimacy, I don't believe that the legitimacy question can be answered in abstracto before you implement the technology. This is a learning process. So I do, when talking this way, I do develop a more open view on security technology. And I'm apparently not the only one. But I do believe that the NGO community, the privacy community, should be more open to it, because we're missing the other side. So what's now happening, and this is reality, is that the security people are negotiating and selling their stuff behind closed doors. So there is no dialogue, no rational dialogue, no cross-examination of their arguments. And I think my approach is more interesting. In the name of consumer interest, let's make them the full price. And privacy needs to have its price. So my argument against the security community would be that a loss of privacy has a price. So pay it. And then these systems become more expensive. And then we can really address the question, do we want those systems?
Well, the security is reduced. That's what I'm saying. Any other comments? I mean, I see a structural problem in this sort of imposition of the consumerist logic on the legal logic, and that's that the fit isn't correct. The consumer of security technologies is not the subject of law, of rights, the person moving, like you described, Hert, but rather the governments, or the ones that are using the equipment that they're looking to secure their ports, their airports, whatever, in the name of the citizen, okay, but nonetheless. So if you want to talk about reimbursement, if you fail to find the bomb on the plane, or the bomb on the plane has to turn around and there's an error made, then the one who's getting reimbursement is the airline who bought the security technology and didn't know it correctly. And the passenger is just a number, it's just manipulated within the equation.
Yeah, I don't see that as a fundamental objection. I see that as the way to go. So now we're getting somewhere. Now we're discussing the real issues. There are interests that do not always, that sometimes conflict. And I would actually, as a consumer, these PNR systems, if you would give me the choice between a PNR checked flight to New York and a non-PNR checked flight, I would take the PNR checked. As long as I do not have evidence that these systems are worthless, I would feel strangely not sitting in one of those planes. But that doesn't bring me necessarily to a position, and this is the balance metaphor in its worst disguise, that I should pay a price in terms of liberties, that I should accept less privacy for more security. That's not the conclusion that I draw. But what happens now is Ryanair is offering us flights for no money, but a part of the cost in terms of privacy is imposed on us. And I would like to a more fair, I think these prices should go up, taking into account the real cost, and privacy has a cost. So I tell you, what am I heading at, people? There is a famous Facebook thing in Holland now. There was a legal student that was completely drunk. She was filmed, and the film was put on Facebook. Yeah? This went around, and her career will be hopeless. Yeah? And she went to court, and the only thing the judge did was saying to Facebook, take that movie out of the site. She didn't get compensation, and the judge refused to impose that any other provider should to impose a prohibition directed to any other provider to show that film. So privacy in law is really poorly treated. There is a harm perspective, and as long as there is no blood, there is no compensation. So in reality, privacy is a human right that is legally poorly enforceable. You will not become rich when you're a privacy victim. And that I would like to see change. I don't have any problem at all with privacy victims becoming very rich. It should be a play, and once in a while I would love to have my privacy violated in return for tons of money. Yeah? So if you take privacy serious, a consumer perspective could be a friend.
I think that's an excellent last word.
Yeah.
What do you think? Well, no. I think we'll leave it there because the professor is going to return to the ceremonies in a number of minutes. Thanks everybody. Thanks for the excellent comments. And of course thanks to the speakers.